Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 500,000 times in over 145 countries and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
This is episode 197 of the Australian Hiker Podcast, and in today's episode we talk all about urban hiking. We hope you enjoy. Before we get into today's episode, if you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published, and if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the Support Us page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. Now, urban hiking is a fairly self-explanatory term, and it implies that instead of hiking in remote or not-so-remote bushland, you instead take the opportunity to hike through your local urban areas. Depending on where you live, this may be through totally built-up towns or cities, better known as concrete jungles, where you may not come across any trees or shrubs at all, through to areas that include local parklands, or if you're lucky enough, through areas that include adjacent bushland. But is this real hiking or just a poor alternative? In the following podcast, we discuss some key considerations of urban hiking, as well as identifying how to get the best out of your urban experience. Now let's talk about why you'd want to do urban hiking. As we record this episode, we've been in lockdown from COVID for roughly about 5.5 weeks.
Recognising others have been in lockdown longer.
or in fact, there's also a number of you that aren't in lockdown and have a lot of freedom and ability to get out and about.
I was going to say there are probably people who haven't been out of lockdown.
But I think for us, this is one of these sort of things. For the last 4 or 5 weeks, due to the restrictions placed on us here in Canberra, the national parks and the major reserves were closed, or they are still closed for at least another few days. We're limited to the amount of time that we're allowed to go out and exercise. Currently, it's 2 hours, and that's only been for the last few weeks. Previously, that was 1 hour. So it's really not a good opportunity to actually drive to a hiking site and go for a hike. It's just not enough time.
Yeah, well, not just an opportunity, we can't.
So I think it's one of those things, I mean, COVID aside, where we do have those limitations, sometimes you don't just feel like driving somewhere. So prior to having issues with COVID, we are now spreading out further into New South Wales to do hiking reviews. In a lot of cases, we've got a 1.5 to 2 hour drive to get to the hike we're planning on doing, do the hike, and then another 1.5 to 2 hours driving back. So in a lot of cases, it's sort of 5, 6, 7 hours worth of driving just to do a walk. So it's not unusual where we can and where we have the ability, we'll try and do a couple of walks in the same location. But sometimes you just don't have that time available. You just don't feel like driving. You wake up one morning and think, I want to go for a walk, but I don't want to spend ages to get there. And this is where urban hiking gives us the ability to get out and hike. And I do say hike and not bushwalk here. Bushwalk tends to imply that you are going into the bush.
You'll find some bush.
Whereas urban hiking, it may involve bush, but often it means, as I said, you're walking through city areas, you're walking through urban areas, and you may pick up the occasional bit of bushland. I think there's a bit of a pattern for a lot of us, and it doesn't matter where you live, what part of the world, what part of Australia, we tend to focus on the town or the city we're in relation to how we live. So we'll go from home to work, we'll go from home to the shops. Every so often we might go into the local entertainment precinct or sports stadium. But there's a lot of areas of the city, particularly in the bigger cities, that a lot of people tend not to go to.
Well, we found that when we were doing the podcast around the Bondi to Manly walk. We got lots of feedback about people who hadn't ventured out of their particular space and were saying, this is something I want to do now.
As I said, this is typical of most of us. Most of us will stay to certain parts of our town or city and avoid others. One of the big advantages of urban hiking is choosing your own experience. Now, urban hiking can take many forms, and unless you're following marked trails, and there are urban trails in a lot of cities, this is a real choose-your-own-adventure option with no limitation placed on what you see or do. You can pretty much start your walk by just walking out your front door, do a loop of a suburb, or if you want something more challenging, you can do a much bigger sort of loop. And one of the walks that I refer to in the written article for this podcast is the Canberra Centenary Trail. This is a 145-kilometre trail that loops around Canberra and takes in bushland, nature reserves, urban areas and the city areas. So it's a bit of a hybrid urban sort of walk. And you can. That's a marked trail, but you could choose just to walk out your door and turn left one day instead of turning right, and see something totally different. And this gives you the opportunity to have an endless supply of hiking available.
Yeah, I think that's right, Tim. And I think sometimes, we do get into that sort of familiarity of going the same way or going to the same place or doing the same thing. And, there's something very liberating about, as you say, stepping out your front door and turning the opposite direction to the direction you would normally go and seeing things that you just hadn't noticed before. And sometimes, you can take some joy in some quite simple and perhaps ordinary things.
I think from my perspective, and probably from our perspective, I've walked every street and roadway within our own suburb, but once we go past that...
You can't name them though, can you?
No. I can name the main ones, but don't ask me to name some of the other ones. But, I'm very experienced in my own suburb, but there's a huge area of the city of Canberra where I just haven't gone down the streets and just had a look around. And as Jill mentioned, the Manly to Bondi walk, I saw areas of Sydney that I've never seen before, and I'm convinced there's probably a lot of people who live in Sydney who have never seen before. So this just gives you a good opportunity, as I said, to choose your own experience. And it might be as simple as saying, well, okay, I suppose I should say here, when does a walk become a hike? If you're just going down 100 metres down the road and turning around again, I'd probably class that as a walk.
Stroll, that'd be a stroll.
But if you're putting a pack on, you plan on going out for an hour or a couple of hours, I think that sort of falls into the hike category.
I think for me, the definition of a hike is you've got something like a pack, you've got water, and you've got some food.
Yeah, that's probably not
even if a snack.
That's probably not unreasonable.
So the next thing to consider is it's really part of your planning and what you need to do to get out. And there are a couple of areas that we'll talk about. The first one is navigation. And, when you're in a city, when you're in a town, it doesn't get more difficult than checking out Google Maps and deciding which way to turn when you feel like turning. I think, Tim, in the article you've talked about paper maps. I'm not sure what they are anymore. I'm not sure that it's a bit hard to, carry the Gregories or the Melways or whatever it is around with you. But, navigation is very, very, very simple. And even if you're not familiar to the area, you can start with your own place of origin and you can guide yourself back to where you started if you're not familiar with the area. So getting lost is probably not a big consideration when you're urban hiking.
I must admit, as I was writing this article and preparing for this podcast, one of the things I was doing was having a play with Google Maps and just working on a couple of proposed hikes that I've got coming up over the next 12 months. And these are long hikes. So they're not, for a lot of people, they'd probably be a 2 or 3 day sort of thing. But I'm trying to get fit enough again to do these really big days and do the extreme adventures. But it's not always necessary to do that. But from a mapping perspective, Google Maps was just so easy to work with, and and I've used Google Earth in the past to actually plot a course, and it's just something you can sit there and work with your phone. You don't have to worry about having a GPS or getting a topographic map out, and in other cases you may not even need a map. But if you're trying to do something specific and go to a particular area or look at something very particular, that's when having a route planned out helps really, really well. And as I said, the electronic mapping systems, easy way to go.
So the next thing we'll talk about food. I did mention that my definition of a hike was when you had food in your pack, but I think also the definition of an urban hike could be when you're planning to get food along the way. So you can visit cafes, you can have it in your pack, but you can visit cafes, you can, or arrange a picnic, you can go to a restaurant. So lots and lots of different options and lots of different places to, again, explore that you wouldn't normally explore.
In our last episode 196, we did talk about a Bondi to Manly walk, and we interviewed Tara Wells, the author of the newly released guidebook. And she said when she got married, she and her husband did their honeymoon on the 80-kilometre Bondi to Manly walk. And this classes as an urban or a semi-urban walk. And they did it in a relaxed sort of manner. They didn't do it in 2 days or 3 days, but it gave them the opportunity to stay at places along the way, to stop in at restaurants, to have swims as they were going. So, what better reward to a hard day's hike to go out to one of your favourite restaurants as part of your walk?
And, also, just in that example, accommodation is easily accessible. So, you can go out and return home and then start off the next day at the place where you finished, or you can take advantage of accommodation options along the way and just keep going and do it over a few days. We are assuming that people are out of COVID lockdown and they can wander a little bit further. But even if you can't, there's a certain amount you can do in a couple of hours in a 5-kilometre urban hike.
And I suppose the last thing to finish off the accommodation is guerrilla camping. Now, this is not a common occurrence in Australia. I do know people who do this, but this is camping in areas that you aren't supposed to. Now, it's not going to be particularly easy to set up a tent in the middle of an urban area unless you're pretending to be a homeless person.
Yeah, not so sure it'd work out in the parliamentary triangle. Although maybe, there is a precedent for that, but anyway.
But certainly I will own up here. I have done a couple of nights of guerrilla camping over the many years that I've been hiking and camping. It's really been a matter of not planned, but it was like, well, this is where I've ended up. I've got no choice, so I'll camp. But you don't make it obvious. You camp out of the way. You camp out of sight. We're not encouraging people to break the law or do the wrong thing, but sometimes it just happens, and it's an opportunity if you don't have an option to camp out of the way, preferably not on someone's property, but it's there and it's an option, and I know people do it.
So the last thing we'll talk about is gear, and as I said, having a pack or something that you can carry bits and pieces in is important. It's interesting, you don't need as much gear as you would if you were out bush proper, but you still need a fair amount. So you need to be able to stay hydrated. You need to have some food options along the way and be confident that if you're not going to take food, there's food places where you can buy food. We talked about the phone and being able to navigate. You might need your rain jacket and a sun hat and just in case. So there are all sorts of things that you might need. And so you do need to be able to carry all of that in something, and something that's comfortable. And what better option than a day pack?
And I think the comment I'd make here from a logistical perspective, you can make an urban hike as complex or as simple as you would like. You can carry a full-size hiking pack that you would normally carry if you are going out bush. You can carry something a bit smaller. And if you are staying in accommodation, or if you're planning on returning home each night and starting fresh again the next day, you're not going to need a tent. If you're buying food along the way, you probably don't need a stove. So it's a chance to scale back if that's what you want to do, but you can also carry your normal gear. But it does mean that you're typically moving a bit faster because you're carrying lighter weight and less as you go. The other thing that I'll mention here as well is water. Now, I have run out of water on an urban hike in the past, and it's not so much that the water's not available. I mean, you can generally pick up water bubblers or you can drop into a shop and buy a drink. But sometimes I feel a bit guilty in some areas about going and using someone's tap in their front yard. I always like to ask. But I have been in areas where there are no taps in the front yard. Or the taps are so well hidden, it looks a bit strange if you're rummaging around people's yards. So there's been a couple of
particularly if you're trying to fill a water bladder, that's not a discreet thing to do. You know?
So it's the sort of thing that as I said, I have gone and knocked on people's doors when I've had no other option. Particularly doing the Canberra Centenary Trail. For me, that was a 3-day hike, and I had an average temperature of around about 35, 36 degrees.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's good to do that in really hot weather, Tim. Not.
Now let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of urban hiking. And again, any hike of any type has its pros and cons, and urban hiking is no different. So the advantages tend to be, as I said, you can start your hike as soon as you walk out the door, if that's what you want to do. There's no reason that you have to be driven somewhere to start your walk. As we've mentioned, the navigation is easy. It has the potential to be easy from a logistics perspective. You can return home each day and then start again or stay on the trail, so you've got a lot more accommodation options. You'll see parts of the town or city you never knew existed. And as I said, when I did the Centenary Trail, I came across parts of the city that I'd driven past in the past, but I'd never actually stopped in and looked at. It's an opportunity to visit favourite restaurants, cafes, and certainly what's becoming big in the States is doing urban hikes where you walk from microbrewery to microbrewery. So it's a potential to do something like that as well. And one big advantage over a lot of bush hikes is you can bring your dog with you as well. But again, be conscious of, you can't go into some areas with dogs like national parks if you drop into those. And there may be some areas where dogs are not allowed. But I think if dogs are on a leash, normally in an urban hiking situation, you've got a good option to bring your dog with you if that's what you want to do. Disadvantages, and there are always disadvantages. It's typically not great for solitude. It's rare you'll do a walk and not see anybody. But if you're doing it early in the morning, if you're doing it during the colder weather where people are less likely to be outside, you will get less people around. But if you're in a busy city, you're going to see a lot of people. You're also going to see a lot of traffic as well.
Yeah, I don't like the road noise or the car noise. I don't mind it for a short period of time, but not for too long.
The other thing is you typically tend to be working on hard surfaces, which is hard on the feet and legs. I have done long walks in various places, and every time you get to road walk, occasionally I've had no choice but to walk on the bitumen edge of the road, and that's very different than walking on the compacted earth on the side of the road or on grassy areas. And it does tend to be hard on your legs and feet. Although in those sort of instances, you do often travel a bit faster. But yeah, it's the sort of thing that...
And you're not carrying as much as well.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing, though, you do need to toughen up your legs and your feet and be conscious of that because it will impact it.
So now let's look at some of the dangers. And, there aren't too many, but there are a few to be mindful of. It's not the same as it would be if you were out in the bush proper, but there are a couple of things to think about. One obvious one is you have to be careful when you're crossing busy roads and making sure that you don't get run over. If you get distracted by this new thing that you'd never seen before, that's probably not a good thing if that happens when you're crossing the road.
Well, while Jill's mentioned that, again, I'll refer back to the Canberra Centenary Trail. It's been very well designed. There were a number of underpasses that I went under and avoiding major roads and highways in the process. I have ended up crossing busy city roads, but again, you're doing that at traffic lights. So they've deliberately walked you past a set of traffic lights rather than forcing you to cross in the middle of the road when there's cars travelling around. So well-designed urban hikes, or if you're designing urban hikes, keep that in mind that you may have to cross these roads, and where's the best place to do it.
Other danger, not sure danger is part of this, but neighbourhood dogs, I guess it's danger if they come at you barking and they want to bite you. So, be mindful of that. But we've got a bit of an issue at the moment with dog poo. That's a danger. It's a danger if you step in it. But there's some photos in the article of some very helpful people who have taken those little black doggy poo bags, and they've scooped up the doggy poo and they've put a knot in the bag and they've put it in a tree. Not sure why you would go to that trouble. If you've, bought the bag, you've filled the bag, you've knotted the bag, and then you don't take it home. I don't understand that.
We actually did a social media post on this and had the photo posted, and someone suggested it may have been people who had just put it so where they could easily find it on the return trip, but we're still waiting for it to disappear.
Yeah, there are two bags that we've taken a photo of, and they've been there for days, so they're not coming back anytime soon, I'm guessing. Tim talked about needing to make sure you had sufficient water, so what to do if you run out, and where you'll be able to source, particularly if you run out while you might be walking through parkland or some bushland, and you have to get all the way through that before you can get to the next water source.
I'll give you an example with this one, and again, I keep on referring back to the Canberra Centenary Trail. On my last day of this walk, it was on a Sunday afternoon, so it was day 3, and I was going through the Canberra Arboretum, so that was still accessible. There were walking trails that go through there, and I was getting low on water, and thankfully there was a water bubbler at that facility, but it was closed, so I couldn't actually buy anything, and it was just lucky there was a bubbler there. But there was this one bubbler, and then I had about 3 or 4 kilometres still to walk, and I'd come 3 or 4 kilometres without having access to water either. So it's as much as you think water is really easy to find in a city or an urban area, if you're doing it when everything's closed, if you're doing it early in the morning or late at night when there aren't any shops open, you may have issues with water loss, particularly in the hotter weather.
Yeah. So, the lesson there is to make sure you've got sufficient water and not rely on what you might find along the way. One of our last things to think about is remembering your stranger danger lesson from when you were at school. So you are in an urban area, there are a lot more people around, and just be aware of your surroundings and be aware of who's around. People who might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable just because you're not quite sure what they're up to.
And I think that's the thing. I mean, one of the things people often say, aren't you worried about being alone in the bush? I think anyone that's likely to have a go at you is generally lazy. They're not going to walk kilometres out in the middle of nowhere
for days
to rob you. It's if you happen to be walking by yourself through bigger cities in remote areas, that's always a potential. So I think situational awareness is probably the term, paying attention to what's going on and being aware of people that are surrounding you.
Yeah, and I think that, don't be fearful and don't let it prevent you from getting out there. Just be aware of what's happening.
Okay, so as a final wrap-up for this, for me, hiking is hiking. And while I do love getting out into the bushland and getting away from the noise and the technology and the people, I'm not a purist in that I'll not go hiking just because, in my case now, the bush is inaccessible. So, we can get back over the last couple of weeks, we can get back into adjacent bushland, but we are lucky enough to have that accessible to us, but not everyone does.
And we've also started to turn right instead of turning left.
We have. So I think from my perspective, urban hiking has the potential to allow you to see parts of the town or city, as we've mentioned, that you may have lived in for years and didn't even know existed. Now, while you're not going to get the panoramic views or the abundant wildlife, urban hiking does bring its own unique experiences and provide opportunities to stay fit, to spend time with family and friends, and to discover your town and city. To answer the question, urban hikes are real hikes, so don't dismiss them out of hand. You never know, you may become a fan. Okay, so we hope you've enjoyed this introduction to urban hiking. As we've said, don't knock it until you've given it a try. And this has certainly inspired me or prompted me to, or in fact, it's actually jogged my memory of a couple of hikes that I had planned over the last few years and for some reason just went totally out of my mind. So I've got a bit of planning to do over the next few months and aiming for some autumn long-distance hiking within the city itself. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. That's all from me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.